Thank you for joining us for this Oxford Internet Institute webinar, Destroy the Internet Advertising Economy with this one weird trick, with Tim Hwang, hosted by Dr. Scott A. Hale of the OII. A little housekeeping, we are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and the video will be available on our website. You can pose questions using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered at the end of the talk. Please keep them as concise as possible. They will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted and commented upon. We will endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries after the talk. Please allow me to introduce Scott Hale.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with Tim Hwang, who, as you've heard, is the author of Subprime Attention Crisis. And this is a book that I think has just been really exciting to read. So I'm really looking forward to discussing with you, Tim. But just maybe as a sort of background, let me give a proper intro to Tim. I think he's one of the most preeminent doers and thinkers of our modern internet and sort of digital communications. He is a policy fellow here at the Oxford Internet Institute and also a board member of Medan, a global technology not-for-profit working to build a more equitable internet, which is an organization with it, which I'm also affiliated as director of research. In addition, Tim is the former director of the Harvard-MIT Ethics and Governance AI Institute and previously served as the global public policy lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning at Google. And welcome, Tim. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Just to kick people off, I mean, why digital advertising? What got you interested in this topic in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of a funny story. You know, when I told my mother I was working on this book, she was like, that's probably the most boring idea for a book I've ever heard. And so, you know, the origin of the book really is in the time that I spent at Google. You know, as you mentioned, I had basically been there for about 2 years, serving as the global public policy lead for AI and machine learning. And one of the interesting things I think about working at Google is actually on a day-to-day basis, people don't really talk about how the company, you know, makes money. It's one of the most intriguing aspects of the company, right? You have advertising, right, which constitutes some 80% plus of the company's revenue. But on a day-to-day basis, people are talking about self-driving cars and artificial intelligence and all the cool kind of technology, you know, gee whiz kind of stuff that's going on at the company. And so as a result, you know, I was joking with a friend just the other week that, you know, advertising ends up being kind of like an urban legend or a rumor. You know, you basically go to someone who works at Google and you say, how do we make money? And they say, well, advertising, of course. And then you're like, but how does it really work? And I think a lot of people just immediately, you know, don't have any answer to that question. And so that got me really interested. And when I started digging, I thought the funniest thing that happened was I have a bunch of friends who worked on these ad systems, and they would say, oh, you know, our advertising system is very effective, but I can't tell you how or why or present you any data because then I'd have to kill you effectively. And that was just so interesting to me that there's this kind of shroud of mystery around what is arguably the financial jet fuel that powers the internet. And so in many ways, the kind of project of the book, whether or not you buy the argument, I think is just to kind of explain in plain terms, like, what is this machinery that is running all the time and really puts dollars in the pockets of Silicon Valley, but also tech companies all around the world.
Fascinating. Yeah, and it really did get me thinking as well, because, you know, primarily I'm a computational social science researcher, and, you know, I wouldn't say that I particularly am concerned with digital advertising in the research that I'm doing, but I think you really laid out in the book why this is something that actually affects us in so many ways, in you know, internet advertising, digital advertising being connected with so many other things. And as I went through the book, I kind of wanted to group some of my reactions and questions into a couple of different areas. So maybe we can start off with just sort of talking about the current state of internet advertising, like,
Sure.
you know, where are we at? And then after that, talk a little bit maybe behind the scenes and how did we get to where we are, and then zoom out to that bigger picture, in terms of, as I was saying, how it's connected to things beyond advertising itself. And to all of our attendees, I should say I won't go on for too long. I think we could talk about this for a long time, but I just want to open up with a few questions, and then give you time to find that Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, drop in your questions there, and I'll make sure that we have at least half the time for actually answering audience questions as well. So maybe to get started then, the sort of current state of internet advertising. You have some fascinating statistics in there around how advertising has evolved, and even what were the initial banner ads like. And this is a point where I wanted to get a little audience participation, and maybe get a poll in here, because there was a stat about how often banner ads were clicked on when they first launched in 1944. And I can see that we have some keyed audiences here, yeah. And I have to say that my recent experience running an experiment on Facebook, we were trying to recruit people to fill in a survey, and we were paying them £5. We said, click this ad, complete the survey, and we'll pay you £5. And it was abysmal how many people we had a hard time paying people. Saying, hey, click here, fill in something, and we'll give you money, and that was hard. So yeah, I think we've gotten some votes there. Maybe we can share that out with the attendees, and people are saying
interesting distribution.
Yeah, almost evenly split, but 4% near the end of the range is what I think the majority have, plurality have gone with. And I would have been happy with a 4% return even now. I think, I don't know what it is these days, but yeah, what did you find in your research for the book around this?
So I think this is a really fascinating aspect of sort of the modern, what's known as sort of the programmatic ad infrastructure, right? Which is, on some level, it's very intuitive, right? You have this massive machine for distributing messages. You have all the data in the world to target those messages. Like, how could it not work, right? Like, how could you not generate messaging that would recruit, say, people for your survey? And I think one of the really interesting things is that, let's take banner ads, for instance. The answer to the question is 44%, right? When banner ads were first launched on the internet, close to half of the people that saw it clicked on it, right? And that almost is, it's almost like a statistic from a parallel universe compared to the metrics that we see now. In fact, most of what we see in the world of click-through rates and banner ads is something like 0.03 to 0.01% click-through rates. I think that's just one indicator. And there are some arguments as to why click-throughs may not be a good metric or may be a good metric. But I think it's a useful signal for, whether or not there's something going on, right? And whether or not there's something about internet advertising which is actually capturing less attention over time. And I think in many ways, the kind of argument of the book, right, is to basically say, well, maybe this whole engine that seems so omnipotent is actually a lot less effective than it looks, and kind of thinks through those implications. And so in some ways, that 44% to 0.01%, right, 100 times reduction in, just about a decade or two, I think is a really intriguing thing to consider.
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess this is some of the 3 points that I think I got from the book, where people are paying less attention to ads. Secondly, you talk a bit about ad blocking, whether people are even seeing these ads,
Sure.
and then the issues of fraud as well.
Yep.
And so, yeah, people are paying less attention to ads, but also we have this sort of rise of ad blockers, and I guess in a way, who chooses to block their ads result is also a bit of, who can has the technical know-how and in other aspects. maybe even ability to pay for subscriptions, I guess, to get free content. Yeah, how do you see these forces sort of playing out in modern digital advertising?
Definitely. Well, so let's take a step back, because I think there's a lot of kind of conflicting, overlapping, complex issues in the ad ecosystem. But one way of thinking about it is frequently this debate gets reduced down to, do ads work or do ads not work, right? And there's a fascinating realm of literature on that I would love to get into. But I would say that it's worth thinking that even before we get to the question of whether or not ads work, there's many layers at which the ad ecosystem can fail, right? And so maybe there's kind of like 4 questions that I'll list out. The first one is the ad delivered to a person at all, right? Okay, yes, no. If we jump through that hoop, then it's a question is the ad delivered to the right person, the person that you intended? That's almost a second problem. Okay, like yes, no. All right, let's say we can do that then. Then the next one is, okay, maybe the ad is delivered, but then is it actually even seen at all, right? It appears in the browser, but maybe it's blocked on the browser end by an ad blocker. Or, hilariously, Google itself did a study a number of years ago saying that close to 60% of ads are just never seen because they're placed on really dumb places on a website. Like they're below the fold. You never scroll to the ad. And then only finally then, right, if we get through all these layers, it's delivered to a person, it's delivered to the right person, it's actually seen. Only then do we finally arrive at the problem of, do ads actually influence people? Do ads actually work in some broad sense? And so, Scott, I think what you're pointing at is actually the 2 layers before, right? This problem of blocking and this problem of fraud. And I'll take each in turn, right? Ad blocking is pretty, familiar. I block ads. I'm sure many of you do on the call as well. And the important thing to know about it is that it's growing really rapidly. Right now, I think the last study that I saw was about 75% of North Americans block ads. But interestingly, ad blocking is expanding extremely quickly all around the world, right? And so there's actually a real big question as to whether or not ads will be even able to effectively get through to people. Ad fraud also presents, I think, a really interesting problem in the space. There's a study in 2017 that suggested about 56% of banner ads are fraudulent. And it's worth taking a step back to figure out how the ad fraud sort of economy works. Basically, the scam is that you have an ad buyer that goes and purchases an ad on one of these marketplaces. But essentially that the ad is delivered either to no one at all, right? It's delivered to a click farm or a bot farm. Or it's basically delivered to a group of people who are paid to click on ads, essentially, and sort of the fraudster pockets the difference. Now, this might sound like a kind of niche scam, but the scale of it is incredible. So there's some studies that suggest that basically 1 out of every $3 that are put into the ad ecosystem is consumed by fraud, right? That actually is not delivered to the person that you intended. It's sort of delivered to a fraudster that's just there sort of providing fraudulent attention, if you will, right? The ad's not actually delivered. It's interesting to think about whether or not there's other markets that kind of work along these lines, right? So the analogy that I know you brought up in the book was sort of, imagine supermarket, right? Which is like you go and every 3rd item that you buy on the shelf turns out to be actually fake, right? I would venture to say that you probably wouldn't go back to that supermarket. And I do think it's one of the really interesting things is that, again, there's these philosophical and very interesting questions about whether or not ads work, but in many cases, the ads never arrive at all. And I think that's really a big problem that's presented in the ad ecosystem as it exists today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just to dig a bit further into that, we've talked a little bit about equitable access, who blocks ads or who doesn't, or who could pay for ad-free subscriptions. And I know in our conversations previous, you brought up this idea of sort of not in my backyard, and
right.
Yeah, I wonder if you could just expand upon that a little bit for our audience.
Yeah, definitely. This is actually kind of a strange kind of segue, but I'll bring it back to the question that you asked. Like one of the things I'm really interested in is kind of the idea of whether or not sort of concepts in urban politics can sort of be brought into our discussion of sort of attentional politics online, right? So that's very jargony, but let me introduce it with what made me think about it in the first place, which is if you're familiar with the phrase "living rent-free in your mind." I'm just like very intrigued by the idea that like, oh yeah, we can think about the head as like a form of real estate, or like attention as a form of real estate. And as we think about kind of and this now goes to something I know, Scott, you want to touch on later, with sort of the activist politics around all this. I think there's a way to kind of frame up things like ad blogging as a kind of sort of attentional NIMBYism, if you're familiar with the phrase, right? So like not in my backyard. And essentially that's what we see in many cases, right? Is that people are willing to say, okay, well, we have this big ad infrastructure that has all of these social problems, privacy invasion, the security problems of aggregating huge amounts of data. But I am someone who has the wherewithal to kind of buy myself out of it, right? We can pay for the ad blockers or, take advantage of these types of services, right? The classic case is the Kindle case, right? We pay extra to not have ads delivered through the Kindle. And I do think that so far has been sort of accepted as a social norm, but I would love to kind of start a project of making that less acceptable, right? That to say that it's not acceptable for you to say, so long as I treat within my sort of like attentional walled garden, my attentional gated community, I'm okay with the state of the web, right? Because I do think that this ecosystem has really broad implications, and we can sort of only sort of distance ourselves from them, even if we have sort of privilege for a short period of time. And so I do think that there is a question about like equity here, and particularly as you get to the question of, okay, we have this problem, so what do we do about it ultimately?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love the idea of thinking more collectively and not just on the individual. Oh, it's not affecting me. I can get out of it. So
Sure.
what do I care? Yeah, I think really important point. In let's come back to those wider implications in a moment. But I also want to sort of flip around, if you like, and look at the backstage, what goes on behind the scenes. And I think you do a really great job in the book of sort of laying out the whole sort of premise in the sort of digital auctions and things that happen with ads. And it makes perfect sense when you explain it. But I really didn't know about these sort of connections to financial markets and in the way that those were sort of influencing the development of internet advertising. And I wonder if you might say a little bit about that, because it kind of goes to the core of the book in terms of subprime attention crisis, well, subprime mortgage crisis, back in 2008 or so, and in this sort of subprime attention crisis that you're drawing attention to now.
Sure, absolutely. So I think one of the great, and I think reasonable minds can differ. I think it's one of the sort of intentionally kind of provocative aspects of the book, right? Is to say, okay, the title of your book, Tim, is Subprime Attention Crisis. Is the ad market really like subprime mortgages in 2007, 2008, right? And I agree. I mean, I think that there are limitations to this metaphor. But one of the things that's like literally interesting about the metaphor is that there is sort of an ideological connection that links the design of modern day sort of ad markets or attention markets with the design of sort of capital markets and financial markets, right? And this is a legacy that I go into a little bit in the book, which I find like incredibly intriguing. And it's this basically, which is that we normally think about the sort of companies like Google or a company like Facebook, right? Like really being sort of like the preserve of tech nerds, right? Like guys in hoodies, right? Like in garages innovating on the internet. And I think what's so interesting is that when you look at this core piece of internet infrastructure, right? The ads infrastructure, and really it goes to kind of the early history of Google, what you find is that while engineers really built a lot of the technical infrastructure that's necessary to pull some of this stuff off, the template for it really comes from economists, and it comes from people who worked in finance. And in fact, a lot of the really early ad tech entrepreneurs were all people who formerly worked as kind of brokers on the stock exchange. And were otherwise involved in that universe. And so, one of the arguments of the book is to try to kind of show these connections and kind of make the argument that like ultimately there is this very deep relationship between sort of the architecture of attention markets online and sort of the architecture of the financial economy. And if you believe that the financial market, right, has certain problems built into it, which I do, right, then you could make the claim that sort of these attention markets might inherit the same sort of pathologies. And that's sort of the effort of the book, is to kind of like make that argument. And so I think the subprime mortgage crisis sort of it's both metaphor, but I think it's in some ways it's also literally true, right? That actually it turns out that some of the same kind of economic models, right? And even how you think about how buying and selling attention in the space is very akin to the history of these financial markets.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes even to the terminology. Once you pointed out like ad exchange as stock exchange,
Yes, that's
like,
right. Yeah. And I mean, even like the language of like trading desks, right? And like, it's kind of like this whole, it's very much kind of like an homage, if you will, to the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that again I found very interesting was this role that standardization, commodification have played in the same way that I guess you could trade on futures, and the future value of a resource, a natural resource, something that actually exists. People are trading on these sort of non-direct forms of digital advertising, or they're allowing, they created secondary markets or opportunities for middle people to be involved in the trade. And this was just something, I wasn't at all sort of aware of myself, and I'd really again maybe just a bit more understanding.
Sure, yeah, happy to talk about that. Yeah. I was joking with a friend, or actually a friend was making fun of me the other week, saying like, metaphors, you're supposed to use metaphors to clarify an issue, but like you have picked a topic, which is subprime mortgage crisis, which is like a notoriously Baroque as a topic. But I do think that it actually is useful in a lot of ways. And I think one of the ways is kind of thinking about this distinction between the asset that's sold in a market and the actual underlying sort of object that it represents, right? And so this is a little bit philosophical, but I think is actually, if you think about it, is quite intuitive, which is what is attention and how do we buy and sell it, right? And it turns out that, right, like attention is this kind of amorphous thing, right? Like there's no attention-o-meter that I can like point at you, Scott, and say, you're paying 7.6 attention to Tim, right? And so what's interesting is the idea of creating a marketplace, especially a liquid marketplace, where it's easy to buy and sell attention, requires us to standardize, right? And it's effectively that what we've done, right, in the attention markets of the internet, right? So for example, a visit to a site, for instance, there's like a very specific definition that there's a group called the IAB that standardizes this, which is, is the ad in the window of your browser for more than a second, right? And so essentially what we've done is we've created an asset class, right? Which isn't literally attention, but sort of defines or attempts to package attention, right? And I use this argument to try to go into essentially the exploration of like, okay, we've got these ads being bought and sold, but that's quite distinct from the question of, are they actually capturing any real attention, underlying attention? And the point of comparison here is in the subprime mortgage crisis, a part of what you had was essentially these packages of mortgages, and the mortgages themselves weren't actually being sold, right? You had this asset, the CDO, the collateralized debt obligation. And part of the problem here was that there's this divergence between the value of the underlying asset, that is to say mortgages, and the thing that was actually being the sort of core of the market. And I sort of are making a similar claim in the ad space, right? Which is that we see ads being bought and sold all the time. We shouldn't necessarily assume that that means that the market is healthy, or even that like what is being bought and sold is actually real, right? And that's a little bit of kind of what I get into in the book around sort of standardization and commodification in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a couple questions already coming from the audience. Thank you, everyone, and please keep them coming. I think actually the first one that came in from Alex in a way touches on this, which is, given the low response rates for banner ads and other things, how are advertisers responding? And I'll maybe take that part first, and then we'll leave the rest. Like, yeah, if attention is decreasing, we're facing all these problems. Why haven't advertisers, why hasn't the market adjusted for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the market has adjusted in some ways, right? And I want to be honest about kind of like where the argument is strong and where the argument is weak, right? So I think one place where the argument is strong is that ad companies are desperately looking for other ways of making money, both within ads, but also elsewhere, right? Like I think one way of thinking about, all of the kind of wacky projects that Google and Facebook are known for, right? Like VR and self-driving cars and all that, that's typically framed up as like something, it's a strength, right? Like it is like a sign that they are really kind of at the cutting edge. The other way of looking at it is that's actually a form of desperation, right? Like, 80% of your money comes from ads. You desperately want to avoid downturns in that market. And one way you do that is you try to find where the next $1 billion opportunity is going to come from. So I do think that that's one of the responses that has happened, right? Another one is that there's been an attempt to try to figure out how do we expand into new forms of advertising that may be more effective, right? So, for example, advertising on audio, podcasting, right? Podcast ads are very hot. There's a lot of hope on video, right? Which is we're going to advertise Arendt's video, and that's better than these banner ads that no one pays attention to anymore. The problem is twofold. One of them is it's unclear if these new channels of advertising are any better than the old versions of advertising. There's still a lot of fraud, for example, in video. But there's also the question of whether or not it can scale in the same way, right? So we have these two traditional forms of advertising that have dominated the internet for a long time, right? Which is display and search. And it's very unclear if any of these new categories of ads can scale to the same sort of level that these two traditional forms of advertising have had. So, in the search for sort of alternative financial energy, if you will, it's unclear if, these other sources are going to be enough. So I think that's where the argument is strong. Like, I do think that there is some desperation to try to find these other routes, but it's unclear if there's a good alternative. I think where my argument is maybe a little bit weaker is one adjustment that has occurred is price, right? So the 44% banner ad, that would command a lot more money than it does today, or rather it would command a lot more money than it did back then. And similarly, these less effective ads have simply declined in price over time. Now, I think the big debate in the ecosystem is some people say, well, it's cheap enough that even though there's all this fraud and all this blocking, it's like worth it, right? My counter is, I think even with that decline in price, it might still be overpriced and inflated, right? But I think reasonable minds can differ on that particular question.
Yeah, and I guess you also talk a lot about the opacity in this, in how, what is a reasonable price be unclear
Sure.
From the market, or reading the argument as well. I often had this, well, yeah, why, if it's sort of auction style, and well, if the corporations are willing to pay the amount that they're putting into these auctions, then is that a sign that it's working? They're willing to pay that amount. What's the pushback there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this is one of the greatest arguments that I've heard from folks in the ad tech industry, which is basically to say, well, people put money into it. Doesn't that mean it must work? Right. And I guess I think that's certainly an argument you can make. I just look at the history of every other financial bubble that has existed for the past 100 years. And the statement that is routinely made before those bubbles pop is, well, there's lots of money going into it. Like, how could it possibly fail? And so I do think that, like, the fact that people are putting money in is not necessarily determinative evidence that the market is in fact healthy. Now, I guess, Scott, you had this other comment about opacity, and I think it's worth touching on. Because I think it can strike you it certainly did me when I was doing research for this book, as a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because all we hear about ads is how trackable they are, right? And how much data we have to see whether or not ads are effective. And in some ways, I agree with that. That's definitely true, and it's difficult to dispute that. I think what we have, though, is an interesting world where we have a ton of transparency into the specific ads that we're launching, but our sense of the overall market is very, very opaque. And it's often determined by a couple of big gatekeepers that sort of hold all the keys to what is the current state of the ad marketplace. So the famous example I always give is a number of years ago, Facebook was saying, okay, we have these metrics that show people are watching a huge amount of video on Facebook. And so if you want to make it as a media company, you should fire all your people and hire journalists, video production people, right? And it turned out later in litigation that occurred, right, that Facebook overstated these numbers by 60 to 80%, right? And I think that just reveals the level of opacity here, right? Which is that it's almost impossible to tell what's going on in the market as a whole, even while anecdotally on the specific level, we may have better tracking of ads than we ever did before. And I think that's an important distinction.
Brilliant. And maybe that does bring us on to some of the bigger questions. I can already see some people asking about connections to disinformation, misinformation, these sorts of things as well. But maybe before we get there, I'm curious in what ways has digital advertising sort of shaped the internet as we know it? You give us a great example of TV sitcoms, and that actually the sort of like creation of TV sitcoms was driven by the need for consistent characters and sort of known plots, so the advertisers would know what they were advertising against. And so yeah, in what way has digital advertising has it affected things beyond simply the ads themselves?
Yeah, I think for sure. There's almost a good argument that ads are almost like a lens through which to read the internet. That basically you can look at almost any affordance that we encounter in the modern day internet and step back and ask the question, why did ads put them here? Just because the influence of this ecosystem is so pervasive, right, and how things are designed. The example that I love to go back to is the like button, right? Like, why do we even have a like button in the first place, right? And well, one argument is that it's very hard to tell whether or not people are engaging with your content, right? And so one easy way of doing that is to create an affordance where people can say, yes, I saw that and I liked it, right? And actually allows you to kind of gain a concrete number, right? And so in some ways, even the kind of most sort of primitive functions of, say, modern day social media are informed by the needs of advertising. And I think it influences not only the design, but you can make a pretty good argument that it maybe also influences like the larger scale behavior, right, of these platforms, right? The sort of emergent social behavior that comes out, right? So if you believe that ads define sort of the design of the platforms, and you believe that the design of platforms has an influence about how social groups behave on those platforms, then there's this very interesting tie, I think, between sort of what the ad economy introduces in terms of incentives and sort of the social phenomena that we see on top of it. And I think this goes to an important point that's sometimes missed about the book, right? Which people say like, this guy is just attacking, the strength of the ad market, right? And I agree. Why should we care that, Mark Zuckerberg might lose a couple more $1 billion, right? But I think regardless of whether or not the market is real or not, or functional or not, like it may have very real impacts in terms of things like privacy, right? In terms of things like disinformation. And so I do think that there's this interesting relationship between like the health of the market and its like reality or non-reality, and its actual impact on society, which I think for sure is real.
Brilliant. Yeah. And I was looking for that question specifically on disinformation so that I could attribute it to whomever asked it.
Sure.
I'm not finding it in this feed right now,
Yeah.
but with apologies to not naming that individual. Yeah, I wonder if we could sort of think about that connection.
Sure.
And I guess a lot of the attendees, say from the Oxford Internet Institute side of this, or other researchers, we think a lot about these social processes that might lead to misinformation or harmful content, hateful content, the role of opinion change and these sorts of dynamics. And yeah, I think you've already addressed some of that in the way that maybe internet advertising has shaped our platforms. But I'd love to just dig a bit deeper into that.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So if you think about the argument of the book, there's a landmine built into it, right? Or a booby trap built into it, right? Which is like, I tend to hang out with a lot of people who are tech critics, right? Who I think are making good critiques about the nature of these platforms. But I think one really interesting thing is that I do think that occasionally we do sort of buy the claims of the big tech companies in our efforts to show like the bad things that they're doing, right? And I think ads are a great example of this, right? Which is that in some ways you have to buy the argument that the ad ecosystem is this powerful, data-driven, mind-manipulating machine, right? In order to critique it, right? You have to agree that it's efficacious in order to say like this is not something we should have. But the implication of the argument that I'm making has sort of, I think, interesting implications for even the critics here, right? Which is that like, if ads are generally not effective, right, then what do we think about things like psychographic targeting, right, or micro targeting, right, which is like maybe those things actually are not as effective as they think we think they are. Now we might want to oppose those things, right? Like there's lots of things bad about Cambridge Analytica outside of the fact that they were able to figure out how to like manipulate the minds of voters, right? But it just may imply that we may want to kind of critique it on different grounds. And I think this has implications for the general misinformation debate, right? Which is, I think, is a very interesting question as to which, particularly in paid media, right? Like, do we think that paid media is one of the key drivers of disinformation? And if we had our druthers, right, we could wave our magical wand. Is ads the main thing that we want to reform, first in this battle against disinformation? And I guess I'm a little bit of a skeptic, having done the research on this book. Like, it's unclear to me like this much vaunted kind of power of the companies that's driven through the ad ecosystem is in fact priority number one, right, in the world of dealing with disinformation. And in fact, it may just be a much smaller kind of segment of the problem that we should be dealing with. So that, I guess that would be my riff on that.
Yeah, but I guess you also in the book go into sort of trying to imagine what would alternatives be, and you make the point that, of course, we didn't have to end up with the
Sure.
models that we have. And yeah, I guess I wonder I'm not an advertiser, but every time I post on Twitter or Facebook or another social messaging platform, I'm always trying to compete for attention, if you like. I
Sure.
feel like I'm competing for that same attention, and maybe that does influence the way that I structure my content, what I talk about, or other things. And yeah, I don't. This doesn't have to reply to this, but I wonder the extent to which we've learned to do certain things based on these platforms that, as you say, have been structured with concerns of advertisers in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think one of the ways of thinking about user-generated content is it's an exercise in, what's known as mechanism design, right? Which is like, how do I architect the incentives of all of these users that I don't control, right, in order to generate a stream of content that is going to be the most valuable for advertising, right? And I think there's a strong argument to be made that like some of the things that you might incentivize those people to do, right, like may put, like Scott, like the example that you gave, put you in a situation where you're like, oh, I feel this weird pressure to like always like try to capture attention, right, or like create the most dramatic thing, right? So it generates the most likes for me, but also simultaneously generates the most engagement that can be advertised against, right? One of the worries that I think about in the book, though, is whether or not this, in some ways, is acting as a form of pedagogy at mass scale, right? That in fact, like a whole generation of people have learned to sort of order their lives online and behave online in a very particular way. And part of my worry is that it actually forecloses alternatives that might exist in the future. So one of the examples that I give, I joke because it's when you hear it, you're like, this is the worst social media ever, right? It's basically like, I call it it's a very 90s name. It's Super Social Media 3000, right? And basically Super Social Media 3000 is a social platform where you don't log in, there's no user profiles, and it's just a bathroom wall that you can scroll on, right? And I think people look at that and they say, look, that would collapse almost immediately, right? But I think the question to ask is like, why would it collapse immediately? And why have we become so sort of pessimistic about these types of free-form platforms? Because I still remember the early days in the 2000s where people said, Wikipedia, that's a model that's going to solve everything. Or like, open comment threads, that's going to be the model that's going to really characterize the internet. And I think one hypothesis is, well, there's two hypotheses, right? One of them is that we were just naive. Those things never worked, right? But the other one is that there's maybe something about how modern social media has trained us to behave that makes those types of free-form spaces a lot less sustainable than they would otherwise be. And my worry is that generates an argument for path dependence, right? That it's very hard now to get users to adopt platforms that would get them not to behave as if they were on an ad-driven ecosystem. And I think that's troubling, right? I think if you're an optimist, you're like, people can learn new behaviors very quickly. If you're a pessimist, you're like, maybe we're just stuck in this, right? But this is sort of like now the realm of deep speculation. Like I think you'd actually have to study that much more closely to kind of get some real conclusions.
Brilliant. And I guess, yeah, we've laid out a lot of these challenges. People are asking about, well, what do we do? And I think that's a fair point. And maybe I'll go to one of the questions. Anshaumina asked, bear with me, it's a little bit of a long one, but I'll read this out so everyone can hear it. But it says, right now, there seem to be a number of questions about alternatives to an ad-driven business model for much of the internet, especially given growing awareness of the corrosive effects of the attention economy has on privacy, content moderation, security, etc. In your book, do you explore potential alternatives? One of the tensions I see is that a free, affordable internet is such an important part of access/rights, but the current leading way to give people access through zero-rating services seem tied to attention economics. What does an alternative look like from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this question is great. And maybe there's kind of two remarks that I'll make to it. I think one thing that I've been thinking a lot about since the book came out is really the fact that in some ways advertising, while providing sort of universal access, if you will, right? There's limitations to the term universal, but like provides wide access to people. One of the limitations is actually that it's allowed us to kind of put off some very hard questions about access, right? Which is to say, like, okay, well, if you're going to just get a search engine for free, we never have to confront the question, like, is it a utility, right? Like, is it as important as having electricity going into your house, right? And I do think that, like, we should confront those questions, right? Because I think they ultimately go to the question of, okay, so what's the alternative here? And I do think that the answer to the question in some of these cases is, yep, we think it's just as important, right, as having electricity in your house. I think that there's lots of people working on this intellectually, right? It's just like, okay, so where do you draw the line here, right? If we agree that search engines require state subsidization or mandates for universal access, does that apply to social media platforms, right? Does it only apply to established social media platforms, or do you get credits that you could also spend on TikTok, right? I think that's like actually a really intriguing set of questions that I think we have hammered out. But my belief is yes, like there are cases you can articulate where the answer has to be, yeah, the public, the government provides like some public good in the sense of paying for access or mandating access. Now, I think there's a second thing that I'll mention on this question, which is, okay, can we find an alternative model, right? And in some ways, I feel like I'm a little bit old-fashioned where I'm like, I don't know, subscriptions, right? Like they work, and it's also a very clear model to get like subsidization to exist, right? Now the problem is, it's a little bit like that scene in Indiana Jones where you have to like switch out the idol and put in like something that's of equal weight. The problem with ads is that it really is jet fuel, right? That we may be addicted to a kind of growth on the internet, which is just very difficult to replace with a business model that we think has better impacts. It's very hard to argue with how quickly ads create fortunes. And so the problem here is that we may very well switch out a business model that we feel is better, right? Only to find that we're confronted with lower growth. Now, I think it's a question of values. Like I personally think we'd be okay in a world where we have slower growth, right? But it's sustainable and has all these social benefits that we like. But I have definitely run into the ad tech bro who will argue like, no, it's like way better for us to preserve this extremely high growth model. And to be clear, I think my position is a little bit more nuanced than destroy all ads, right? Like I think, the question we need to ask is like, do we think ads should be the monoculture that dominates all internet advertising and or internet business models? And I think the answer is no. So maybe just a couple thoughts on that question.
That's great. And yeah, in a way you moved to an area again that I was saying, well, what do we do then, right? What should be done about digital advertising?
Sure.
I guess, yeah. The one hand you could say, well, just leave it and look, over time there might be a correction if that's what's needed.
Mm-hmm.
Through to, I think there's a subheading at some point that says controlled demolition.
Right.
Like how do we, what should we do to try to bring about a correction, perhaps sooner than later? Don't let the bubble sort of get too big.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions asked actually was particularly around, do you see a place for federal legislation around digital advertising? And I guess that falls somewhere in the middle of do nothing or, blow it up. Okay, that's not what the book says, but,
Right.
in this continuum I've created.
Sure. Yeah, so I do meet some people now that the book has come out who had termed, they're kind of like attentional Marxists, right? They're basically like, I agree with the argument in the book, but if that's the case, there's no reason to save the ad economy, right? Like the contradictions of this market will bring it down by itself. And so all we need to do is let the wheels of history turn, the market will blow up, and then we'll move on to like the next model, right? And I guess I'm very much kind of a skeptic of that argument. I also meet some people who say, look, the fundamental problem with the internet is that the protocol wasn't free enough, right? So these are like blockchain heads who are like, once we put everything on the blockchain and decentralize the web, we'll have solved a lot of these problems. I think it misdiagnoses some of the problems. I actually don't think like it is actually like the problem here is not purely sort of like technical in nature. And so I guess I tend to take a much more sort of frustrating position, I suppose, which is like, okay, what we need to do, as we do in other financial bubbles, is a controlled demolition. You want to let the air out of the bubble, but in a controlled way, mostly because you're worried about the human cost of this, right? Because it's not just necessarily like coders that are getting paid $350,000 a year in Silicon Valley. It's the whole ecosystem of media and journalists and like the public sphere that sits on top of this. And so I think we want to be careful with how we take this ecosystem down. And so to the kind of questioner's specific inquiry, I am a fan of federal legislation in the space, and one of the things I'm thinking a lot about now, especially as we are moving to a new administration, hopefully in the United States, is to try to see if we can put forward some policies here that kind of create, say, increased transparency in the space, right? Because I think one of the problems in the market is that there's so much hidden that in some ways revealing very critically the problems in the market is a good way to get it to kind of shrink in size. And I think this will be part of the battle that's playing out in DC right now, where I think it's amusing to me that kind of the only thing you can agree on between Republicans and Democrats in DC is the tech companies suck. And so I do think that there's a chance to kind of like get ideas in this reform phase. But I think nothing has won the consensus yet. And one of my sort of hats in the ring would be let's change up these ad markets.
That's great. And that makes perfect sense, I think, from a US perspective, disclosure, law, et cetera. One of the questions that we have in the chat comes more from the European perspective, where we have perhaps more legislated on privacy or privacy in specific ways. And so Ravi asks, thanks for the great session. I'm the lead lawyer for claimants on the European-wide regulatory ad tech.
Hello.
It seems the current ad tech industry does not and cannot comply with GDPR in its current form. If so, what does behavioral advertising? Where does behavioral advertising go from here? Do you have any thoughts on those case/compliance with other human rights norms?
Yeah.
Also offers that he's a visiting fellow at the OII as well, and so would be excited to connect on this
absolutely.
and discuss further.
Yeah, we'd love to talk more.
We may not get through all of those that point right now, obviously.
That's right. Yeah, so I would love to talk more about this. Here's kind of a weird take that I've been thinking about in this context, right? Which is that in some ways EU privacy laws really may be building the time bomb, the trigger that takes down this ads ecosystem, but probably not in the way that you think, right? So a classic public policy playbook, right, having been someone who did this at Google, right, is for companies to basically be like, don't pass these new regulations. You're going to destroy the industry, right? You're going to destroy America's competitive edge, allowing China to take over the world, right? Like these are classic public policy arguments. And then routinely in the history of business and business regulation is you put the regulations down and then the businesses just deal with it, right? Like it actually turns out to not have been the thing that destroys the industry. And I think there might be something that plays out in the ad ecosystem in exactly the same way, right? Which is in some ways that we've built up all of this sort of reputation, social capital around the idea of data-driven advertising, right? And the advertisers desperately need to keep that vision up because it's the reason money keeps flowing into the ecosystem. And essentially what EU privacy laws are doing is basically running one of the world's largest natural experiments, right? Which is if you suddenly don't have access to this, are your ads as effective, right? And I think the results there could be twofold. One of them is, okay, genuinely, you really need the data and the whole market fell apart. Or it turns out that you didn't need that data in the first place and your ads are just as effective, in which case the market might also like fall down, right? Because it's sort of built on this idea that the data is so critical. And so I do think that in some ways, not just things like GDPR, but also CCPA and a number of state laws in the US that are being played around with have this kind of capacity, right? Like that there's the possibility that we may just really demonstrate that like this emperor has no clothes. And I think that might have a really, really big impact on the sustainability of these markets. And so, so I'm watching it very closely and would love to talk to people who are kind of throwing bricks at this because I think it's one of the kind of, Death Star exhalation vents, that lead into the market.
Definitely. And these sort of build on that in a way, thinking about PECR, GDPR, et cetera. So I'm going to read out two questions here that I think we might be able to take in together. The first one from Richard Price. The ad tech industry in the UK is being investigated by the Information Commissioner's Office for breach of PECR and GDPR regulations. Could tighter controls over personal data create another dimension of friction for the ad tech industry? I think this was in reaction to what we were discussing around laws and legislation. And then Nayan Jones asked about how much of a policy gap and implementation do you think there is between legislation, GDPR, et cetera, and how digital marketing actually operates in the wild?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me tackle the, I guess, first question, right, which is related to a little bit of what we talked about, but I think it kind of helps to emphasize a theme that's come up throughout the session, right, which is, and again, I'm sure there's a lot of people in the call who will be able to kind of correct me on this, but I think it's really intriguing watching the ICO kind of report on, the ad economy, Cambridge Analytica, that whole kind of universe of things. In some ways, I think it's doing what we talked about, right? Which is that in some ways it's deflating sort of the illusion that we have around the power of targeted advertising, right? And then in fact, one of the ICO's conclusions is that, well, actually maybe Cambridge Analytica really totally overstated its abilities to like understand psychology through data and target ads really effectively. So I do think that these types of investigations are good, but again, in a sort of a counterintuitive way, right? Because I think the ICO, like it makes the public policy case a lot stronger if it turns out that you really do have, the mind control ray, for instance. But I do think that like in some ways these ad scandals kind of produce the grounds for us to kind of do these investigations and get a lot more transparency than we have in the past about the nature of the ad markets. And so I think it's good. And in some ways it's a great self-own, right? Because I think a lot of the ad companies are, creating the problems that prove that their market is maybe built on sand. So I think that kind of chain of events, I think, is really interesting. Now, there's a very key question, which is the second question around implementation gap. And I actually, frankly, think the implementation gap is huge, right? Because I think that this is not just a matter of like legislators being old and not understanding, the ad economy, right? Like I go to the very top of this session where you talk to engineers at Google who also don't understand how the ad economy works, right? And so I do think that there is almost like a big need for, it's almost an exercise in digital civics, right? Which is like, how does the electricity come into your home? Like, we should also know how the ads get into your house. And I do think that there is that need there, just because I think that part of the risk is that it remains kind of shrouded in mystery and is technical in a way that I think might limit really effective legislation in the space. And so I do think that the gap is one of the biggest gaps that we face in really making change here.
Brilliant. And you've mentioned the example of Cambridge Analytica a few times. There's some reactions to that. I'll make sure I mention that.
Sure.
Reaction,
Yeah.
which I think was more a reaction than a comment,
Yeah.
than a question. But also there was a question here, just more generally about political marketing on social media,
Yeah.
from Carolina, and she was asking, what's your opinion on the political marketing on social media? Should it be regulated? Recently, the markup revealed that ads targeting voters in critical states were more expensive for Biden, who intended to flip the particular state, than it was for Trump. This is just one of multiple examples of the hidden marketing policy's impact on democratic processes, and it seems that such risks will only continue to grow.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So there's a number of the specific class of political advertising I think is really interesting. I guess I'm still a hawk in that I say like political advertising is just like the rest of the programmatic advertising, which is that the case for effectiveness is very limited. I've heard some really interesting arguments to the contrary, right? So, Cory Doctorow, right, kind of made the argument that like the real benefit of political advertising is it's a way for you to let really extreme constituencies know that you share their views, but in sort of a private channel way, right? That doesn't reveal it to the rest of the world, right? So the example here is like, the Trump campaign advertising stuff, which is like very close to being white supremacy through their ads, but they don't necessarily have to make an official campaign statement of it. So I think reasonable minds can differ on that question. But I would say, even though I'm a hawk on this issue, right, in the sense that I don't believe that political ads are uniquely effective in a way that other ads are not, I do think it still potentially doesn't necessarily destroy the argument that we really should regulate this class of advertising. And the reason being is that the very use of some of these techniques can themselves be corrosive to democratic process, whether or not they ultimately have an effect on votes, right? So I think this is the argument on Cambridge Analytica, which is like we have to divorce the idea that you can literally psychoanalyze someone and deliver an ad to them at just the right time from the idea that, look, the fact that there are firms that are paid to do this and create even the suggestion that you can do it, right? That actually itself is like really bad to democratic process, right? And I think the same is here actually in a lot of the targeted ad space, right? Which is, there may be something about just the inherent use of data-driven advertising for political purposes that make it very, ultimately negative for the sort of ecosystem that you want to create in elections. And so I do think that, again, we have to sort of decouple these two things, right? That the effectiveness can stand pretty separate from the question of whether or not it should be regulated.
Brilliant. And there's so much here. We're not going to be able to get through all of it before the
Sure,
top
yeah.
of the hour. But I know that our events team are ready to drop in some links on where people can get the book. And obviously you go much more into depth on all the things we've been talking about there. But I think there's a question here that maybe backs us up a little bit. And earlier in this conversation, you said, hey, there's no attention meter that you can point at me and measure my attention. But of course, that is what ad companies are trying to say they have. And
Right.
So one of our attendees was asking, especially on social media, could they not rely on metadata, screen time over a certain image, etc., along with clicks as an attention meter?
Yeah, the creation of a standard, while arbitrary, right, exerts its own power when it becomes a standard, right, is the way I would frame up that issue, which is, okay, click-throughs. Well, yeah, they probably capture some form of attention. You have to pay attention to a link to click on it, right, after all. But it's unclear if it really is like it's unclear if it really is like attention writ large, right? But I think once established, right, that metric has a lot of influence, right? So time on site is another great example. Time on site creates the listicle, right? Because you really want to have people spend as much time on a single page as possible. So one way you do that is you create 100 images on an incredibly large link, right? And so ultimately, I guess I cheer on the idea of alternative metrics, because alternative metrics, I think, can generate very different types of sort of content ecosystems that we might live in, even though in some ways it's ultimately a little bit arbitrary as to the philosophical question of do they actually capture attention writ large?
Brilliant. And this sort of, I guess, again, brings us back to some questions. But Matt Hitchens had a question. Apologies, Matt, that it's taken me a while to get to that. And apologies to everyone whose questions I may not get to, but we will be able to follow up on those post-event. So I think this will be our last one. I'm getting a nod from our event staff. But Matt had asked, if ads remain the main source of revenue online, and if they're becoming less effective over time, ad blocking, fraud, these things we've been talking about, does that create a pressure toward more information gathering about consumers in order to compensate for decreasing quantity with increased quality? Might that explain why big tech companies are pushing more information gathering, Internet of Things technologies like Alexa, smart doorbells, et cetera?
Yeah, I think maybe what I'll leave the group here with is just maybe a point about the theater of data, right? Which is, I'm skeptical that more data leads to better results in terms of ad targeting. But the fact that you have a lot of data is very persuasive to a lot of ad buyers. And I do think that that logic actually encourages the collection of data, right? Regardless of whether or not the data is actually useful, you want to collect it, right? Because again, it helps to bolster the power of what you're selling, particularly if you think about Google and Facebook as competing with older generations of ads like TV, billboards, things that are just less measurable. And so I do think that, yeah, there is a very strong logic to the market, right, that encourages data collection. I guess the only twist I'd add to that point is just it's unclear if that depends on ad effectiveness.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have continued for much longer, but we do have to wrap up. I would say, just, are there any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with?
No, this is great. We covered a lot of ground, and yeah, appreciate you for playing moderator.
Well, no, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. It's been a great conversation, and I do commend these books to everyone. I had great fun reading them. Reading this book, Subprime Attention Crisis. It's very accessible.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to Tim for an engaging discussion today, and thank you all for attending. You will receive a follow-up email in due course with the information mentioned in the talk and a link to the recording. We are looking forward to bringing you an exciting event offering next term. These will be listed on the events page of the OIA website in due course. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.